Hi, my name is Corey Stinnett, and this is a three-part analysis of the paper Menagerie written by Ken Liu, using the new historicist, Marxist, and psychoanalyst lenses. In the paper Menagerie, it is shown that life for immigrants is a struggle of power between American values and the immigrants' cultural values, resulting in a fluid situation where assimilation, denial of, and preservation of those values occurs. It's easier for an immigrant to assimilate into a society constraint, whether it is worth it or not. America is considered rude to not speak when spoken to. Because of this, the father of the protagonist believes his wife will come off as rude to the neighbors, so he preemptively warns them about this. In this sense, social exchange of ideas and attitudes are limited because the immigrant party does not wish to conform to the inherent power structures within American society. It would be difficult to communicate with anyone, even a doctor, and so in this regard assimilation would make her life easier. We can begin to see how America is a society in constraint because the neighbor women refuse to interact with either the protagonist or his mother. They don't need to interact with them because they can successfully speak to each other. The things they have to say about those who can't understand them are extremely rude, and prove that civilians born into American society believe they wield some sort of authority over those who are first or second generation immigrants. The language barrier proves too difficult for the average citizen to overcome, and so assimilation would help to remove that language barrier to some degree. Another example is the case where Jack complains about his mother not belonging. It's at this point where he has begun to think of himself as American and not Chinese. It's also at this point where he begins to see his mother as part of the problem, because her inability to assimilate makes life harder for him. American society is unforgiving to those who choose not to play by its rules. Denying one's cultural values in place of another's is one method to cope with the inequalities formed for immigrants in a society of constraint. As a young boy, Jack could tell that he was being treated differently. His young brain didn't know any better, but he was being discriminated against in a society predominantly made of white people with a history of racism and nationalistic hatred towards China. This is evidenced when the other 10-year-old boy says, "Here's your stupid, cheap Chinese garbage." He is far too young to really understand the implications of what he just said, and that shows that this is a system of discrimination that is embedded into American society. He learned that behavior from those before him. Jack attempts to deny his cultural heritage in order to avoid the feeling he receives from being discriminated against. He's too young to understand what has happened, so he copes by forcing his mother to speak English around him, and to buy him some real toys instead of the trash he now recognizes old toys to be. As Jack grows older, we see that taking the easy route and denying his cultural heritage did not pay off in the long run. It was unhealthy to deny his mother's existence and half of his own existence for as long as he did. Shutting out the world and sticking his head in the sand only stood to prolong the inequalities his mother felt as part of the system of constraint in America. Preserving one's cultural heritage is a difficult but noble path that many immigrants choose to face. The mother of the story shows the persistence and love required to preserve her cultural heritage in order to pass it along to her son. This is made even more difficult by the inability of American society to adapt to her needs, but she persists despite this. Even when she feels that her son hates her, and her husband doesn't understand her, she continues to keep the traditions of her people alive in her heart. This pays off in the end of the story when the protagonist starts to believe in the practical magic of his old toys, which start to come back to life again. From the new historicist perspective, this seems to be a metaphor for the revival of Jack's Chinese cultural values becoming a part of his persona once again, despite the overlying powers in American society making this difficult. American culture did not completely stamp out his Chinese values, but made him feel that he needed to repress those values in order to belong to society as a whole. It wasn't until Jack had grown up and began to understand the troubles his mother went through that he had appreciation for the fact that she tried her best to preserve and pass down her cultural values to him. Moving on to the Marxism criticism. Split between the family's ideologies affects every aspect of their lives, from their family bond to their mental health, and even how they interact with one another. The difference in American and Chinese ideologies drives a wedge between family members, destroying the bond between them. Mark is a character who spends time with Jack at his home one day. The introduction of Mark is used as a metaphor for the introduction of capitalist ideologies in Jack's young mind. Mark teaches Jack what most people are thinking of him secretly, and this only serves to drive the family apart, as evidenced by what Mark said. Here it becomes clear that Jack's class difference matters to his peers in America, and he begins to perceive himself as being separate from his mother. Essentially, Jack is mentally placing himself above his mother due to the ideologies enforced in him from a young age. Everything begins to become a comparison to what the neighbors have, which feeds into the capitalistic sense of material wealth being important in American society. Jack even begins to compare his own mother to other better moms who don't embarrass their sons by resisting the false consciousness that society forces upon them. Jack conforms to the false consciousness spoon-fed to him from a young age because not doing so negatively affected his mental health. Based on the first piece of evidence, it is clear that Jack is dealing with a barrage of class discrimination that comes out in the form of racist remarks. He deals with this from the neighbors and from his classmates. This is what likely drives Jack to accept the false consciousness of American society as his new reality. This is a real turning point in the story, as Jack no longer sees himself on the same level or class as his own mother. This is proven in the second quote, which reads, "It was a mistake to have tried to take a Chinese peasant girl and expect her to fit in the suburbs of Connecticut." Jack was beginning to distance himself from his mother to the point that he considered her a peasant, and himself a person with the means to produce something more worthwhile in society, much like the proletariats and the bourgeoisie. When Jack says, "It was hard for me to believe that she gave birth to me. We had nothing in common," he is really trying to cement his new ideologies by basically disowning himself from his own mother. In this way, he seems to believe that he is free from the class discrimination that he faced, the irony being that he was enforcing that discrimination on his own mother. A difference in ideologies can affect everything, down to the most minute detail of how families interact. Accepting the false consciousness changes the way in which Jack and his family communicate until the day his mother died. When confronted with extreme class discrimination, Jack asked his dad if he looked a certain way, to which his father replied no, in exasperation. It's this exasperation that is important, because the split in ideologies causes additional stress at home that didn't exist before. This new stress is elevated as Jack begins to yell at his own mother, saying, "English," I said, raising my voice. "Speak English." It's clear that the stress and these reactions were caused by resisting the false consciousness of American society. This permanently affects their lives in unforeseen long-term ways until, sadly, his mother died while he was flying to go back to work. This final development shows that the son went from a doting, loving son to a cold and callous individual, thanks to the long-term effects of the split in their ideologies. He was too busy to stay with his mother as she died, leaving her alone with his dad so he can go to produce more for the society that did this to them. Moving on to the psychoanalyst criticism. Through the lens of a psychoanalyst, the paper Menagerie is a story of a family torn apart by an inferiority complex, neurotic behavior, and repression. The protagonist develops an inferiority complex which pushes him away from his mother. As Jack begins to grow up, he starts to realize that his experiences aren't the same as other kids at school. One of the kids, named Mark, tells him that his toys are garbage, which begins to make Jack believe that his lot in life is worse than the average person. This is where his inferiority complex would begin to grow, and be directed at his mother, who made the toys for him. After a terse conversation at the dinner table, Jack's mother feels sadness or shame for not being able to speak English, and Jack says he wants some real toys, implying that he now also believes that what he had before was garbage compared to the other kids. Finally, to prove he is directing the reasoning for his inferiority complex towards his mother, he says, "Other families don't have moms who don't belong." Somewhere along the way, he went from loving his mother to shunning her because of his inferiority complex, which drove the family apart. Jack's mother begins to display neurotic behaviors because she has to deny a part of herself when Jack is around. Thanks to Jack's inferiority complex, the mother was forced into a position where she felt she could not express herself the way she wanted to. Because of this, she was often seen acting in a way, in what Jack believed to be irrational or neurotic ways. The mother felt a great deal of anxiety because her idea of a family had been broken when her son shunned her from his life at a young age. She believed that he would be the reason the family would be able to bond, and instead he ended up being the reason they became distant. Her neurosis pushed her into a corner, where she was too afraid to confront her son on his behavior despite knowing English by that point. It's not as though Jack would beat his mother, but their complexes led them to act as though they are both in an abusive relationship with the other, which explains both her fear and his distaste for his own mother. Her neurosis and Jack's inferiority complex would only serve to separate the family even further. Repression acts as another force that could drive a family apart. The entire family is guilty of repressing their true feelings on multiple important occasions. The mother is the most repressed in the family due to her circumstances as an outsider as her son views her. She specifically told them she has a hard time expressing herself in English, but they insist that she must try anyway. This only leads to alienate the mother to the point where she is repressing her feelings so much that she doesn't want to bother her son with the news of her cancer. It also leads to her not taking care of her physical health. Because of her repressed feelings, she didn't take care of the cancer until it was far too late, driving the final wedge between the family, effectively dismantling it there with her death. The son did not feel guilty or sad for his mother as she lay dying. Instead, he was thinking about his own needs, since he had already distanced himself from her. This is merely another form of repression, because Jack is in denial that he had anything to do with this. But the evidence of his regret is in the fact that the story is written as though Jack is analyzing his past through a more mature lens. This and the mother's letter and his reaction to it are proof of his repressed guilt. Through these three lenses, it is possible to devise a story of a family in disarray thanks to the internal and external forces acting upon them. This includes the power of the state, an unchanging society, capitalism, and the mental disturbances that these forces can cause. In a way, these three lenses could be seen each as a part of a whole analysis on the human condition. Applying all of them at once is a discipline in understanding the foundations of each viewpoint or lens. Using all of them together, we can understand that there are no black and white characters in literature or life. Everyone has a gray area, and families don't fall into this condition overnight. It's a complicated web of forces acting on this family that cause them to be the way they are. It's also possible to see through the combination of these lenses that the powers that act on the family are always developing and changing. To study the human condition is to understand that humans are complicated and subject to change, and with these lenses we can better understand the situations we are in.